So today we're going to talk about solving quadratic equations. Just like we did in the last class, but the last lesson, the last video we had, was on solving quadratic equations by graphing. However, today we're looking at it in a different method. We're going to solve them by factoring. Now before we get into any examples, I want to talk about a property called the zero product property. All the zero product property says is if the product of two quantities is equal to 0, then at least one of the quantities is equal to 0. Algebraically, we can write that as if we have a times b and it equals 0, then we say a is equal to 0 or b is equal to 0. So that now can get us into our first example, where we're going to utilize the zero product property to solve the expression x minus 3 times x plus 7 equals 0. In this case, we can think of x minus 3 as our a and x plus 7 as our b. So in order for this to equal 0, either x minus 3 has to equal 0 or x plus 7 has to equal 0. We're going to solve both of them because we could potentially have two answers. So with this first one, we need to add 3 to isolate x, so we find that x is equal to 3. And in the second one, we have to subtract 7, so we find that x could equal negative 7. So we did find two answers, x is equal to 3 and x is equal to negative 7. They're not going to happen at the same time, but there's two spots if we were to graph this x minus 3 times x plus 7, two spots on the x-axis that the function would cross at. So now, those kinds of problems aren't too difficult. They're already factored for you. If we have something that is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c set equal to 0, we can factor that and then use the zero product property to find the values of x. That would make this true. But one key thing is we need to have this set equal to 0. If it's set equal to anything else, then we need to make it be equal to 0. So let's look at some more examples. We'll look at example 2, where we're going to have x squared plus 7x plus 10 and set that equal to 0. Now we're going to factor this. So we're going to set up our little factor x. We want numbers that multiply to make 10 and add to make 7. Since we've got a plus at the back, our two factors are going to be x with the middle term plus x plus equals 0. Now I write numbers that I know multiply to make 10, like 1 and 10, and 2 and 5, and since they're both positive, we add them. 1 plus 10, that makes 11, which is not what we're looking for, but 2 plus 5, that's 7. That is what we're looking for. So we're going to have an x plus 2 and an x plus 5. Now this looks like our last example, so we can set each of them equal to 0. X plus 2 equals 0 and x plus 5 equals 0. The reason being is we're trying to figure out what x values do make this equal 0. So if I solve x plus 2 equals 0, I would subtract 2 and get x is negative 2. Or I can look at the other one, x plus 5 equals 0. I need to subtract 5 from both sides and get that x is equal to negative 5. So if I were to actually graph x squared plus 7x plus 10, I would find that at x equals negative 2 and x equals negative 5, that graph crosses the x-axis. Let's take a peek at our next example. We'll call it example 3. We're going to have x squared plus 2x equals 8. But here's the thing. This does not equal 0. So before we can actually solve this for x, we need to make it equal 0. To do that, we just need to get all the terms on one side. Since I've got it, the x's are all on one side, I'm just going to move this 8 to the other side by subtracting 8. So I'm going to end up with x squared plus 2x minus 8 equals 0. And now I can solve it by factoring. I'm going to want numbers that multiply to make negative 8 and add to make 2. So when I'm setting my factors up, I'm going to have an x in both of them. Since I have a minus at the back, I need these to have 1 plus and 1 minus. A positive and a negative have to multiply to make a negative. So in this part, I'm just worrying about finding numbers that will make some version of 2, either positive or negative, and then I can switch them around. So numbers I know multiply that make 8 are 1 and 8, and 2 and 4. We could always switch them. Now if I were to go a positive 1 plus a negative 8, that gives me negative 7, which even if I switched them, made the 8 positive, the 1 negative, that's just positive 7. That's not what I'm looking for. With a positive 2 and a negative 4, I get a negative 2, which, that's close. That's halfway there. We do want a 2, so we're just going to switch the 4 and the 2. Make 4 positive and make 2 negative. So I'm going to put the 4 with my x plus and the 2 in my x minus. So now I can set these both equal to 0. X plus 4 is equal to 0, and x minus 2 is equal to 0. Now with the first one, I'm going to subtract 4 and get x is equal to negative 4. In the second one, I'm going to add 2 and find that x is equal to 2. And then I'm done. I found two values of x. Let's look at another example. We'll call it example 4. We're going to solve x squared plus 2x plus 1 equals 0. It's already set equal to 0, so we can do our little x. We want numbers that multiply to make 1, add to make 2. Now when I'm setting my factors up, I'm going to have an x and an x. Since I have a plus at the back, I take the middle sign, so they're both x plus. Now I only know two numbers, or really one number, that multiplies to make 1, and that's 1 and 1. And if I add them, I know they make 2. So I'm going to have x plus 1 and x plus 1. Here is the thing. If we have the same factor happening more than once, like in this case, we have x plus 1 and x plus 1. They're the same thing. We just have to set it equal to 0 one time. We do not have to do it twice. So if I were to set this to 0 and subtract 1 to solve for x, I find that x is equal to negative 1. And that's the end of example 4. So I've got two more examples. Example 5. We're going to have negative 2x squared equals 18 minus 12x. Now, I'm going to just move everything to the left side. So I'm going to add 12x to both sides, get negative 2x squared plus 12x equals 18, and then I'm going to subtract 18 on both sides. So I'm going to have negative 2x squared plus 12x minus 18 equals 0. Now, before I factor, remember there's one thing we should always look for. is there a greatest common factor? And I look at these three terms, and I see they're all divisible by 2, and we have a negative out in front. So I'm going to pull out a negative 2, and I'm going to be left with an x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals 0. Now we can factor. So we're going to want numbers that multiply to make 9 and add to make negative 6. So when we're factoring this, we've got negative 2 times x, 2 sets of parentheses with an x. Since we've got a plus at the back, we want to take and put the same sign in both factors, and it's that middle sign, so x minus and x minus. So we want two negative numbers. Numbers that I know multiply to make 9 are 1 and 9, and then 3 and 3. So if I have a negative 1 and a negative 9, that makes negative 10, which is not what we want. But if I have two negative 3's and add them, that does make negative 6. That is what we want. So we're going to have an x minus 3 and an x minus 3 times negative 2 is equal to 0. Now, here's the thing with this negative 2, we don't have to worry about that when we're solving. And since we've got two x minus 3's, we're just going to set x minus 3 equal to 0 once. So we're going to add 3 and find that x is equal to 3. So in this case, we just have one answer, and that's 3. Now I've got one last example. It's a word problem. So example 6, we're going to say the height of a diver above the water during a dive can be modeled by the equation h is equal to, I'm going to have to come and handwrite this in, negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 48, where h is the height in feet and t is time in seconds. We want to know, or we want to find the time it takes for the diver to reach the water. So our function, again, was negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 48. So we're going to factor that. We're going to take negative 16t squared plus 8t plus 48 and factor it. Now I look at those three terms and I know that they are all divisible by 3. So first we set it to 0 and I said divisible by 3. I really meant to say divisible by 8, and since we have a negative out front, we're going to take out a negative 8. So we're going to have negative 8 times 2t squared minus t plus, not plus, sorry, minus 6 equals 0. Because when we're, and I spelled diver wrong up here, when we are wanting to know when the diver reaches the water, that would mean that the height is 0. So, we're going to do that. We are going to look for, in fact, this time we are going to do the AC slide while factoring. We're going to take 2 times 6, negative 12, is what we want the numbers to multiply to, and add to negative 6. So, here's the deal. Since we've got a minus 6 at the end, we want one positive, one negative factor. numbers I know multiply to make 12 are 1 and 12, 2 and 6. And actually, I wrote one of the numbers here wrong. I do not want to add to make 6. I want to actually add to make my middle term, which is negative 1. So 1, 12, 2, 6. I know 3 and 4 also multiply to 12. And I believe that's it. So if I had a positive 1 minus 12, that gives me negative 11, not what I want. Positive 2 minus 6 gives me negative 4. Even if I switched, that's not what I want. 3 and 4, with 1 being positive, 1 being negative, that gives me negative 1, which is what I want. So, we set up our factors. Negative 8 times 2t. Remember, we take 2t in both of these this time when we do the AC slide method. And then we go plus 3 minus 4 equals 0, but that 2t minus 4 is divisible by 2. So we can write this as negative 8 times 2t plus 3 times t plus, not plus, t minus 2 equals 0. Now this 8, that doesn't really matter when we're solving. So we're going to take 2t plus 3 equals 0 and t minus 2 equals 0. Now with this first one, if we subtract 3, we're going to have 2t equals negative 3, and then we divide by 2. We're going to have one t value. That's negative 3 halves, but we can't have negative time, so we're going to ignore that one. Let's check the other one. We're going to add 2 to solve, and t is equal to positive 2, which we can have positive time. So it's going to take the diver 2 seconds to reach the water. And that's going to wrap up our lesson on solving quadratic equations by factoring.